Gunfire in the pouring rain. The deafening roar of an explosion, shattered glass raining down like diamonds. That was the last thing Dominic Castellano saw before his world went pitch black forever. Betrayed by the woman he loved and the brother in arms he trusted, the city's most feared syndicate boss was reduced to a broken ghost in a sprawling, empty mansion. He was ready to let the darkness consume him. He had given up entirely, until a silent maid, a girl invisible to everyone else, reached out and gently took his shaking, scarred hand. Dominic Castellano had once held the city by its throat. At 32, he was the undisputed head of the Castellano crime family, a man whose whispered name commanded both terror and absolute respect. He was a force of nature, sharp-eyed, ruthless when necessary, but bound by a strict code of loyalty. He thought he was surrounded by people who shared that code. He was wrong. The ambush at the naval shipyards was meticulously planned, executed with a precision that only an insider could possess. Dominic had arrived expecting a standard negotiation with a rival faction over smuggling routes. Instead, he stepped into a slaughterhouse. The explosive device hidden beneath the steel grates of the warehouse floor detonated the moment his boots crossed the threshold. The blast killed 4 of his best men instantly. Dominic survived, but the shrapnel and the intense thermal flash robbed him of the one thing a predator needs most, his sight. He woke up in a sterile underground private clinic, his eyes wrapped in thick gauze. But the true agony didn't come from the physical burns or the realization that he would never see the sunlight again. It came 3 days later in the dead of night when he lay perfectly still, pretending to be sedated. The door to his recovery room clicked shut. 2 voices drifted through the darkness. "The doctor says the optic nerves are completely severed," a woman murmured. Her perfume, expensive, heavy notes of jasmine and vanilla filled the room. It was Victoria Kensington, his fiancée, the woman he was supposed to marry in 2 months. "Good," a male voice replied. "That makes the transition easier. The capos won't follow a blind cripple. By the time he figures out how to walk to the bathroom without breaking his neck, I'll have the Northern Territories locked down." The voice belonged to Damien Cross, Damien, his underboss. The man Dominic had pulled from the gutters, fed at his own table, and treated like a brother. "Are you sure he didn't see you before the blast?" Victoria asked, her voice laced with a sickening mix of anxiety and affection for the other man. "He didn't see anything but fire." Damien chuckled softly, the sound twisting a knife in Dominic's chest. "We own the city now, Tori. Let him rot in the country estate. He's a dead man walking anyway." Dominic didn't move a muscle. He didn't breathe. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal shattered his spirit more completely than the bomb had shattered his body. They had played him for a fool. 2 weeks later, Dominic voluntarily signed away temporary operational control of the syndicate to Damien, citing his recovery. He packed his bags and retreated to the Hawthorne estate, a sprawling, isolated Gothic mansion nestled in the dense pine-covered mountains of upstate New York. He went into exile. The king surrendered his crown. Weeks bled into months. The Hawthorne estate became his tomb. Dominic descended into a deep, agonizing depression. He smashed the antique mirrors in the hallways, furious at his own vulnerability. He drank heavily, the premium whiskey burning his throat, numbing the phantom pains of the explosion. The local staff hired to maintain the massive property, terrified of his violent outbursts, began to treat him not as a boss, but as a monster locked in the attic. They neglected their duties, whispering cruel jokes behind his back, stealing fine silverware, and serving him cold, careless meals, knowing the blind boss couldn't see their insolence. Dominic knew. He could hear their whispers. He could taste the stale food, but the fire inside him was gone. Betrayal had hollowed him out. He simply didn't care anymore. He was waiting to die. Madeline was a ghost long before she stepped foot in the Hawthorne estate. 5 years ago, a brutal home invasion had stripped away her family, and in the aftermath of the severe psychological trauma, her voice, Doctors called it selective mutism, a defense mechanism against a world that had proven too loud, too violent. At 24, Madeline communicated only through written notes and the expressive depths of her large, observant brown eyes. She was hired through a discreet domestic agency that asked no questions. To the rest of the staff at the estate, Madeline was the perfect scapegoat. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a bitter and greedy woman, piled the hardest, dirtiest tasks onto the mute girl's shoulders. Madeline didn't complain. She scrubbed the long marble corridors, polished the heavy oak banisters, and quietly navigated the oppressive shadowed halls of the mansion. It didn't take long for Madeline to notice the truth about the master of the house. The other maids spoke of Dominic Castellano as if he were a demon. They refused to enter his private wing unless absolutely necessary, and even then, they practically threw his meals onto the table before sprinting away. But when Madeline finally saw him, she didn't see a demon. She was dusting the library when she first laid eyes on him. Dominic was slouched in a massive leather armchair, staring blankly out a window at a courtyard he couldn't see. He was a striking man, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp aristocratic features and a heavy, dark beard that spoke of weeks of neglect. But it was his posture that caught her breath. He sat with the devastating stillness of a man who had entirely given up. The scars fading around his temples only highlighted the tragic emptiness in his dead gaze. That evening, Madeline watched from the kitchen corridor as Mrs. Gable prepared his dinner tray. The meat was overcooked, the vegetables cold, the coffee tepid. Mrs. Gable didn't even bother placing the utensils properly. "Let the blind bat fish for it," Mrs. Gable scoffed to another maid. "He doesn't know the difference." Yet a quiet, furious spark ignited in Madeline's chest. She knew what it was like to be helpless. She knew what it was like to be stripped of agency, to be treated as less than human, simply because you lacked a certain ability. The next morning, Madeline began her silent rebellion. She sneaked into the kitchen before dawn. She prepared a fresh steaming plate of eggs, perfectly toasted bread, and rich boiling hot coffee. She arranged the tray meticulously, the fork strictly at 9 o'clock, the knife at 3, the coffee mug securely at 2. Consistency was vital for someone who couldn't see. When Dominic awoke and felt his way to his sitting room table, Madeline watched from the crack in the doorway. He reached out his large hands, fumbling defensively. His fingers brushed the hot ceramic of the mug. He paused. He cautiously touched the fork, tracing its position. He took a bite, and for the first time in months, a flicker of confusion crossed his hardened, bearded face. It was warm. It was perfect. From that day on, Madeline became his unseen guardian. She realigned the heavy furniture in his wing that the other maids carelessly moved, preventing his agonizing bruise collisions. She opened the heavy velvet drapes just enough to let the afternoon sun warm the specific armchair he favored. She left the balcony door slightly ajar so the fresh scent of mountain pine would filter into his stagnant room. Dominic noticed. In a world made entirely of touch, sound, and smell, the subtle shifts in his environment roared like thunder. Someone was moving the obstacles out of his path. Someone was making sure his clothes were perfectly folded and easy to distinguish by texture. Someone smelled faintly of lavender soap and clean linen, lingering just out of reach, breathing softly at the edges of the room. "Who's there?" he barked one afternoon, his voice gravelly and harsh from disuse. Madeline froze by the bookshelf, a feather duster clutched to her chest. She couldn't answer. She backed away silently, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the Persian rug. Dominic's brow furrowed. "I know you're there. I can hear your breathing. Who are you?" When only silence answered him, he gripped his cane, his knuckles turning white, a wave of familiar paranoia crashing over him. Was it one of Damien's spies? "Speak!" he roared, hurling his crystal whiskey glass at the wall. It shattered into 100 pieces. Madeline flinched, slipping out the door before he could find her, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was terrified of his rage, but beneath the fear, her heart ached for him. She recognized the anger. It wasn't malice. It was profound, isolating grief. The breaking point arrived in the form of a violent autumn storm. It began in the late evening, the sky turning a bruised purple before unleashing a torrential downpour. Thunder cracked over the Hawthorne estate with the force of artillery fire. In his master suite, Dominic was violently thrown back in time. The booming thunder mirrored the horrific explosion at the docks. Flashbacks assaulted his mind, the heat, the screaming, the smell of burning ozone and copper blood. He stumbled out of bed, his chest heaving, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The power grid failed. The estate plunged into total darkness. Not that it mattered to Dominic's eyes, but the sudden cessation of the air conditioning, the hum of the refrigerator, the ambient noise of the house, it made the booming thunder infinitely louder, more oppressive. He was trapped in the warehouse again. He tripped over a misplaced ottoman moved earlier by Mrs. Gable out of sheer spite and crashed heavily into a glass coffee table. The glass shattered, biting deep into his forearms and palms. Dominic collapsed onto the floor, bleeding, gasping for air in the grip of a massive panic attack. He couldn't do this anymore. The betrayal, the darkness, the utter humiliation of his existence. He dragged his bleeding hands across the floor, feeling for the bottom drawer of his nightstand. His fingers found the cold, heavy steel of his loaded revolver. He pulled it out, his whole body trembling. He sat back against the wall, the shattered glass digging into his legs, and slowly raised the barrel toward his own chest. It was the only way to take back control, the only way to silence the thunder. Down the hall, the rest of the staff had retreated to their quarters to drink and wait out the storm. But Madeline had stayed behind. She had been searching for extra candles when she heard the crash from the master wing. She ran down the hallway, bursting through his double doors. In the flashes of lightning, she saw him. The terrifying Mafia boss, the ruthless king of the underworld, was sitting in a pool of blood and shattered glass, shaking like a frightened child, a gun pressed to his heart. Madeline didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the danger. She threw herself onto the floor, ignoring the sharp shards of glass that sliced into her knees. Dominic heard the rustle of fabric, the sudden movement in the room. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice breaking in a hoarse sob. "Get the hell away from me!" He expected the intruder to run. Everyone ran from him now. Instead, a soft, warm presence dropped to the floor right beside him. Before he could react, small, gentle hands reached out through the darkness. They didn't grab the gun. They didn't use force. Instead, Madeline wrapped her soft fingers entirely around his large, scarred, trembling hands holding the weapon. Dominic gasped, his entire body stiffening. Her touch was incredibly warm. It wasn't the hesitant, fearful touch of the staff, nor the manipulative, possessive grip Victoria used to have. It was an anchor. It was pure, unadulterated compassion. She knelt there in the glass, bleeding with him, holding his hands with a quiet, fierce strength. "Let go," he choked out a tear, finally escaping his unseeing eyes, mixing with the blood on his cheek. "I have nothing left. Let me go." Madeline shook her head, even though he couldn't see it. She squeezed his hands tighter. She moved closer, resting her forehead against his trembling shoulder, letting her steady, rhythmic breathing serve as a metronome for his erratic panic. "I am here," her touch said. "You are not alone." For 10 agonizing minutes they sat on the floor while the storm raged outside. Slowly, Dominic's breathing began to match hers. The violent tremors racking his massive frame began to subside. The heavy steel of the revolver slipped from his grasp, clattering harmlessly onto the floor. He tentatively released his white-knuckled grip, turning his large, bloody hands over to feel the small ones holding them. He felt the soft skin, the slight calluses on her fingertips from scrubbing floors. He traced his thumb over her knuckles. "You're the one," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "The one who moves the furniture, the one who makes the coffee." Madeline squeezed his hand in confirmation. One squeeze for yes. Dominic swallowed hard, leaning his head back against the wall, utterly exhausted. "Why won't you speak to me?" Madeline froze. She gently pulled one hand away, took his index finger and slowly traced an X over her own lips. Dominic's brow furrowed as his sensitive fingertips felt the motion. Realization dawned on him. You can't. One squeeze of his other hand. Yes. A profound, heavy silence settled between them, safe and thick, pushing back the lingering ghosts of his trauma. The king of the underworld, blinded and betrayed by the people who talked the most, sat in the dark, holding the hand of a girl who couldn't utter a single word. And for the first time since the explosion, Dominic Castellano didn't want to die. A tiny, dangerous spark of life, of vengeance, of hope, ignited in the pitch black of his world. The morning sun pierced the heavy velvet curtains, but for Dominic Castellano, the world remained an impenetrable canvas of black. Yet for the first time in 8 agonizing months, the suffocating weight pressing down on his chest had vanished. He lay in his massive mahogany bed, the sting of the bandages on his forearms, serving as a harsh reminder of the violent storm, the shattered glass and the cold steel of the revolver. He remembered the small, calloused hands that had anchored him to the earth when he was entirely ready to leave it. He sat up, his heightened hearing, catching the faint rhythmic sound of a broom sweeping the hallway just outside his suite. It was her, the invisible girl. He didn't know her name and he didn't care. She was the only genuine pulse in this suffocating house of ghosts. "Come in," he called out. His voice was no longer the broken, pathetic rasp of a defeated man. It carried a fraction of the old commanding baritone that had once silenced crowded boardrooms. The sweeping stopped abruptly. A moment later, the heavy oak door creaked open. The faint comforting scent of lavender and clean linen entered the room, chasing away the stale smell of whiskey and despair. "You saved my miserable life last night," Dominic stated flatly, turning his face precisely toward the sound of her soft, even breathing. "I don't like owing debts, especially to my own staff." Silence stretched across the massive bedroom. He heard the soft shuffle of her shoes on the expensive Persian rug. Then, a light, warm weight settled tentatively onto his right palm. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, followed by the smooth plastic of a ballpoint pen. Dominic ran his thumbs over the items. A grim, humorless smile touched his lips. "You write." "I read no, that won't work, sweetheart. Unless you can write in Braille, we have a significant logistical issue." He felt her hands gently take his. She guided his right index finger to the smooth surface of the notebook, then took the pen in her own hand. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed the dull back end of the pen against his palm, tracing a distinct shape into his skin. M, then an A, then a D. M-A-D. Dominic murmured, his brow furrowing as he concentrated on the tactile sensation. She finished the word with a flurry of strokes. "Madeline. Your name is Madeline." A single firm tap on the back of his hand. "Yes." "All right, Madeline," Dominic breathed, leaning forward, the predatory instincts of a syndicate boss slowly thawing in his veins. "Here is the reality of the situation. I am blind, but I'm not deaf, and I'm no longer dead. The people running this house think I am a decaying corpse. They answer to the man who put me in this state. I need eyes. I need someone who can see the board and tell me where the pieces are. Can you do that for me?" Madeline stood perfectly still. She knew the inherent danger of this proposition. She knew the terrifying stories of the Castellano family, the blood they spilled, the ruthless efficiency of their operations. But she also remembered the profound vulnerability of the man on the floor last night, the man who had been stripped of absolutely everything by those he loved most. She thought of her own tragedy, the crushing silence forced upon her by violent men. Dominic was fighting the same monsters. She reached out, tracing a slow, deliberate Y-E-S across his broad palm. From that specific morning, the Hawthorne estate ceased to be a tomb and secretly transformed into a training ground. To the rest of the corrupt staff, Dominic remained the tragic, broken recluse. He allowed the spiteful Mrs. Gable to serve him cold meals, maintaining his flawless facade of pathetic apathy. He stumbled intentionally when others were watching, knocking over vases and allowing their cruel sneers and whispered insults to wash over him without reaction. But behind the locked heavy doors of the master wing, a vastly different reality unfolded. Dominic began to aggressively rebuild his physical strength. He used the heavy oak furniture for resistance training, pushing his large lethargic frame to its absolute limits. Madeline guided him relentlessly quietly, moving dangerous obstacles, adjusting his posture with gentle taps, and ensuring he navigated the sprawling room without injury. His muscles, softened by months of severe depression, quickly remembered their former explosive power. The intense, grueling workouts fueled his singular burning focus, absolute vengeance. Their unique communication rapidly evolved into a complex silent language of taps and traced letters. 2 rapid taps meant immediate danger or someone approaching the wing. 3 taps meant the perimeter was clear. A slow, deliberate circle drawn on his shoulder meant she had found something highly interesting. Through Madeline's meticulous observations, Dominic learned the grim reality of his exile. She wrote out exhaustive, detailed lists of the staff's daily activities by tracing the words onto his broad back or calloused palm. He learned that the estate's security detail men he had personally vetted and trained in close-quarters combat had been completely replaced by Damien's incompetent loyalists, thugs who spent their nights playing cards and drinking his premium liquor. He learned that Mrs. Gable was receiving hefty weekly cash envelopes directly from the city, a miserable payment for ensuring his suffering remained absolute and uninterrupted. The entire sprawling estate was a carefully constructed cage meant to keep him contained until he conveniently died of grief or his own hand. But Damien had grossly miscalculated the terrifying resilience of a man who suddenly had nothing left to lose. But Madeline quickly discovered something else, something far more dangerous than corrupt maids and lazy guards. One rainy afternoon, while meticulously dusting the highest shelves of the estate's vast neglected library, she noticed a remarkably loose mahogany panel perfectly hidden behind a massive collection of 19th-century encyclopedias. Prying it open with a letter opener, she found a heavy, formidable steel wall safe. The brass dial was heavily worn but coated in a thick layer of dust clearly untouched for several months. She rushed immediately to Dominic's quarters, pulling him urgently by his cotton sleeve toward the library. Once securely inside with the doors locked, she guided his large hands to the cold steel of the hidden safe, then rapidly traced the letters SAFE onto his palm. Dominic's breath hitched noticeably. "My father's private vault," he whispered, his scarred hands reverently tracing the brass dial. "Damien doesn't know about this. Nobody alive does. Before he died, the old man kept his ultimate contingency funds here. Untraceable bearer bonds, forged emergency passports. If Damien hasn't found it, it strictly means he doesn't have the complete financial ledger of the Castellano Empire." He stood up perfectly straight, his strong jaw clenching tightly. "Damien arrogantly thought taking my eyes took my power. He completely forgot that a king's true power is always secured in his treasury." He turned his sightless, intense gaze toward Madeline. "I critically need you to be my hands, Madeline. I know the exact combination." It took them 3 tense attempts. Dominic recited the precise numbers in a hushed, urgent whisper, and Madeline meticulously spun the heavy brass dial, her fingers sweating slightly. 42 right, 16 left, 30 right. With a heavy, incredibly satisfying mechanical click, the thick steel door smoothly swung open. Madeline peered deep inside the dark cavity, her breath completely caught in her throat. The safe was tightly packed to the brim with thick, pristine stacks of banded $100 bills, velvet drawstring pouches that jingled softly with the unmistakable heavy weight of cut diamonds, and several thick, deeply worn leather-bound ledgers containing decades of secrets. She aggressively traced MONEY on his hand. Then she traced a massive continuous circle on his chest, visually indicating the sheer unbelievable volume of the wealth. Dominic let out a low, dark chuckle, that instantly sent cold shivers down Madeline's spine. It wasn't a sound of relief or joy. It was the terrifying sound of an apex predator spotting its prey's exposed neck. We unexpectedly have the resources. Now we just patiently need the right moment to strike. The pivotal moment arrived precisely 2 excruciating weeks later, heralded abruptly by the distinct heavy crunch of expensive tires violently kicking up gravel on the estate's long winding driveway. Madeline was thoroughly polishing the ornate brass banister in the grand foyer when the heavy mahogany double doors suddenly swung wide open. The sudden violent shift in air pressure immediately brought a suffocating, nauseating wave of expensive perfume, heavy cloying jasmine and vanilla mixed intensely with the sharp, acrid scent of imported Cuban cigars. God, this place is entirely horribly depressing. A woman's sharp, condescending voice echoed loudly through the high vaulted ceilings. It genuinely smells like damp dust and absolute decay. How much longer do we genuinely have to keep blindly funding this pathetic mausoleum, Damien? Madeline completely froze strategically, keeping her head bowed low, her polishing rag moving rhythmically and mindlessly over the brass. She didn't need to look up to know exactly who it was. The vivid, hateful descriptions Dominic had given her were permanently etched into her mind. Victoria Kensington, the traitorous, cold-blooded fiancée. Patience. Tori, a remarkably smooth, deeply arrogant male voice, replied, echoing with unearned confidence, Damien Cross. The board of capos still has a few annoying old traditionalists who foolishly hold romantic notions about absolute loyalty to the Castellano bloodline. If we aggressively cut his funding or simply put a bullet in his head too soon, they might legitimately revolt. We just let nature comfortably take its course. He's rapidly drinking himself to death anyway. Madeline felt a massive surge of cold, protective fury. She diligently kept her brown eyes glued firmly to the marble floor as heavy, confident footsteps aggressively approached the staircase. "You there! The mute girl!" Victoria snapped viciously, her sharp designer heels clicking loudly and aggressively on the marble. Madeline deliberately flinched appropriately, dropping her rag in mock terror and slowly looking up with wide, submissive, terrified eyes. She saw Victoria draped heavily in a luxurious, pristine white cashmere coat, looking fiercely down at her as if she were a remarkably unpleasant, disease-ridden insect. Beside her stood Damien, a conventionally handsome man with incredibly sharp features and cold, highly calculating eyes, wearing a bespoke, tightly fitted Italian suit undoubtedly paid for by Dominic's stolen empire. "Is he upstairs?" Damien aggressively demanded, not bothering to politely lower his voice for the staff. "Is the blind, miserable cripple decent?" Madeline nodded, frantically playing the terrified servant, flawlessly gesturing vaguely and fearfully toward the master wing. "Fetch us some passably decent champagne, if this damp, miserable ruin even has any left, and promptly bring it to his study." Victoria coldly ordered, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Let's get this thoroughly awful business over with. The rancid smell here is completely ruining my appetite." Madeline practically ran in sheer panic toward the kitchens, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She absolutely had to warn Dominic. She entirely bypassed the wine cellar, immediately sprinting up the hidden back servant stairs, desperately taking them 2 at a time. She violently burst into Dominic's suite without knocking. He was in the middle of a remarkably grueling set of rapid push-ups, heavy sweat gleaming intensely on his scarred, heavily muscled back. He froze instantly, his muscles locking at the sound of her highly erratic, panicked breathing. She practically threw herself forcefully at him, fiercely grabbing his sweaty hand and frantically tapping twice. Danger. Then she aggressively traced a sharp V and a strict D onto his calloused palm with heavily trembling fingers. Victoria and Damien, they were here. Dominic's entire demeanor drastically shifted in a microscopic fraction of a second. The highly powerful, extremely dangerous mob boss completely vanished. He violently slumped his broad shoulders, his face rapidly slackening into an incredibly convincing expression of vacant, pathetic, absolute despair. He quickly grabbed his dark sunglasses, violently slipping them over his heavily scarred eyes, and frantically reached for the half-empty bottle of intensely cheap whiskey he strategically kept on the nightstand, strictly for show. He aggressively splashed a highly generous amount directly onto his shirt collar to ensure the undeniable stench of alcohol comfortably preceded him, then clumsily grabbed his wooden cane. "Help me to the study." He slurred heavily, leaning his massive weight heavily and uselessly onto Madeline's small shoulder. "Make it look exceptionally pathetic." They slowly, painfully navigated the long hallway, just as the heavy doors of the study abruptly swung open. Damien and Victoria confidently stepped in aggressively, bringing the harsh chill of the outside world directly with them. Dominic violently stumbled dramatically his wooden cane, carelessly knocking over a small, expensive antique side table. It crashed heavily to the hardwood floor with a remarkably loud clatter. He let out a highly pathetic, long groan, leaning weakly against the wooden door frame, perfectly projecting the absolute image of a thoroughly, undeniably broken man. Damien. Dominic rasped horribly, blinking utterly uselessly behind his thick dark lenses. His large hand trembled absolutely perfectly around the curved handle of his cane. "Is that really you, my God, brother? It's genuinely been so incredibly long." Damien smoothly exchanged a sickeningly amused, highly arrogant look directly with Victoria. He confidently stepped forward, his tone completely dripping with utterly fake rehearsed sympathy. "Dominic, just look at you. I'm so deeply sorry we sincerely haven't visited sooner the heavy business in the city. It's completely overwhelming without your guidance." I know," Dominic mumbled pathetically, blindly, and desperately reaching out a shaking hand. Damien forcefully grasped it firmly, aggressively projecting his new dominance. Dominic expertly suppressed the incredibly violent burning urge to instantly snap the man's fragile wrist in two. "How is the territory or the vital northern route still entirely secure?" "Everything is perfectly handled, Dom," Damien smoothly assured him. "You just intensely focus on quietly resting. We actually brought some standard papers for you to quickly sign. Just incredibly routine transfers. To thoroughly ensure your extensive medical bills and the estate's massive upkeep confidently remain funded strictly without aggressively drawing IRS attention." Madeline stood completely silently in the dark corner, her sharp eyes darting rapidly between the three vastly different figures. She quietly watched Victoria shamelessly wander around the large study, greedily looking at the priceless antique paintings with a highly predatory gleam, clearly already aggressively pricing them in her shallow mind. "Papers!" Dominic asked, his rough voice actively wavering with highly forced, pathetic anxiety. "I absolutely can't read them, Damien. I simply can't see." "I'll gently guide your hand, brother," Damien smoothly lied, quickly pulling a highly thick stack of crisp legal documents from his expensive designer briefcase. "It's strictly just standard, incredibly boring protocol." Madeline carefully edged closer, cleverly pretending to furiously tidy a messy bookshelf. She quickly caught a highly revealing glimpse of the bold black heading clearly printed on the top document. It absolutely wasn't a standard medical transfer. It was a complete, highly irrevocable legal signing over of the Castellano family's incredibly massive primary shipping company, the Absolute Legal Front, for their most intensely lucrative smuggling operations. They were ruthlessly trying to completely steal the very last legitimate pillar of his former empire. She absolutely had to stop him from signing it. As Damien confidently uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and forcefully pressed it directly into Dominic's trembling hand, aggressively moving the dense documents directly onto the smooth mahogany desk, Madeline cleverly and deliberately knocked over a massive stack of incredibly heavy, leather-bound encyclopedias directly from the top shelf, The absolutely thunderous booming crash echoed violently through the entire study. Victoria shrieked in genuine terror, aggressively jumping back. Damien loudly cursed violently, dropping the gold pen in pure shock. "Stupid, incredibly clumsy girl!" Victoria screamed violently, glaring viciously at Madeline with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Get out! Get the hell out of here right now!" In the immediate loud chaos, Madeline frantically scrambled to rapidly pick up the heavy books, expertly ensuring she roughly brushed directly past Dominic's leg. As she forcefully bumped him, she remarkably quickly traced a highly sharp NO directly onto his firm thigh, immediately followed by the distinct letters SHIP, shipping. Dominic's sharp mind actively raced. He understood instantly and perfectly. He deliberately let the dropped pen roll completely off the desk and violently buried his face deeply in his scarred hands, rapidly unleashing a perfectly executed, highly hysterical, echoing sob. "I just can't," he wailed loudly, his deep voice aggressively cracking with highly simulated absolute agony. "I absolutely can't do this. The sudden noise, the incredibly sudden noises, it forcefully brings it all entirely back. The massive fire, Damien, the horrible fire." He violently collapsed completely backward into his large leather armchair, intensely hyperventilating highly dramatically. He frantically clutched his massive chest, violently shaking his head rapidly from side to side. "Not today. I strictly can't focus. My head is violently splitting entirely open. Give me my heavy medication." Damien forcefully looked at Victoria, his sharp jaw clenching violently in extreme, unmasked frustration. The blind, pathetic fool was having a massive panic attack exactly right when he desperately needed a simple signature. "For God's sake, Damien, just leave it," Victoria harshly whispered, utterly disgusted by the highly pathetic display of absolute weakness. "He's completely, undeniably unhinged. Just look at him. He's a total, complete mess. We can easily get the signatures next week when he's highly, heavily sedated. I absolutely cannot stand the rancid smell of this room for genuinely another second." Damien viciously scowled extremely rapidly, shoving the dense documents completely back into his briefcase. "Fine, just rest up, Dominic. We absolutely will be back." They aggressively turned and violently stormed directly out of the study, completely without another word, the incredibly heavy mahogany doors violently slamming completely shut closely behind them. The massive echo of the violent slam vibrated intensely through the thick floorboards, immediately leaving a highly tense, thick vacuum directly in its immediate wake. Complete silence rapidly descended upon the massive room, once more, entirely broken only by the incredibly slow, steady ticking of the grand antique grandfather clock securely in the corner. The highly distinct sound of their remarkably expensive tires, violently crunching on the loose gravel, slowly and completely faded deep down the winding mountain road, taking the absolute stench of their profound betrayal completely with them. Incredibly slowly, Dominic precisely lowered his trembling, scarred hands completely from his face. The entirely pathetic, profoundly broken facade actively melted completely away instantly, strictly replaced by a highly terrifying visage of cold, absolute, deadly granite. He forcefully reached up, violently pulled off the dark sunglasses, and aggressively tossed them directly onto the smooth mahogany desk. He smoothly turned his completely sightless, intense gaze absolutely perfectly toward exactly where Madeline stood, completely frozen. "They actively tried to completely take the primary shipping lines," he said firmly, his incredibly deep voice drastically dropping an entire octave, resonating intensely with deadly absolute calm. It entirely wasn't a question. Madeline cautiously stepped forward and remarkably firmly tapped his broad shoulders strictly once. Yes. Dominic incredibly slowly stood up, actively rolling his massive, heavily muscled shoulders. He smoothly walked directly around the heavy desk with incredibly practiced, flawless ease, entirely no longer heavily kneading his wooden cane in this highly familiar room. He confidently reached out perfectly, finding Madeline's small, fragile shoulder entirely in the dark, his massive grip remarkably firm, but astonishingly deeply gentle. They genuinely, completely think I'm a utterly dying, pathetic dog. Dominic strictly murmured, a highly dangerous, intensely lupine smile, actively stretching widely across his heavily scarred face. They genuinely have absolutely no idea that the dog just finally found his sharp teeth. We are entirely, completely done intensely hiding Madeline. It's actively time to completely burn their fragile new empire directly straight to the absolute ground. He aggressively traced a highly single, incredibly decisive circle strictly on her small palm. It was an absolute, unbreakable promise of intense, violent war. And the completely silent, incredibly brave Maid immediately squeezed his massive hand tightly in return, entirely ready to confidently walk directly into the massive fire, strictly beside the incredibly dangerous blind king. Dominic's resurgence began with a single undeniable truth. A king trapped in a tower cannot lead an army unless he finds a messenger. For weeks, Madeline became his absolute lifeline to the criminal underworld he had seemingly abandoned. The immense wealth hidden within the mahogany-paneled library safe provided the necessary fuel, but they desperately needed a physical sword. Dominic knew precisely who to call. Before the devastating explosion at the naval shipyards, Dominic had deliberately kept a phantom operative entirely off the syndicate's official ledgers. His name was Harrison Cole. Harrison was a ghost, a lethal enforcer who answered strictly to the Castellano bloodline, and no one else. When Damien violently seized power, Harrison had quietly vanished into the city's murky underbelly, waiting patiently for a signal that his rightful boss was still breathing. Dominic carefully placed a solid gold Castellano signet ring into Madeline's small hand. It was the ultimate proof of life. There is a rundown mechanic's garage on the eastern edge of the industrial district. Dominic instructed her in a hushed, intense whisper, tracing the route onto her palm. Ask for Harrison. Give him the ring. He will absolutely understand what it means. Leaving the heavily guarded Hawthorne estate was remarkably dangerous, but Madeline possessed the ultimate advantage, absolute invisibility. To Damien's corrupt guards, she was merely the pathetic mute maid. She slipped out through the dense pine forest during a heavy morning fog, successfully hiking 3 miles to the nearest bus stop. Navigating the grimy, bustling city was a sensory assault after months of the estate's suffocating silence. Madeline kept her head down, clutching the heavy gold ring deep in her coat pocket. When she finally found the grease-stained garage, it looked entirely abandoned. She cautiously stepped inside, the sharp smell of motor oil and metallic dust burning her nose. A tall, broad-shouldered man with fading tattoos covering his muscular arms stepped out from beneath a suspended muscle car. Harrison Cole wiped his thoroughly grease-stained hands on a dirty rag, eyeing the small, fragile woman with immediate cold suspicion. Madeline didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, ignoring her racing heart, and firmly pressed the heavy gold signet ring directly into his calloused palm. Harrison froze. His jaw tightened completely as he stared at the unmistakable family crest. He looked up, his dark eyes instantly flashing with dangerous, loyal recognition. "He's alive." Madeline nodded sharply once. "And he sent you to bring me back into the fold." She nodded again. Within 48 hours, the silent, isolated Hawthorne estate secretly transformed into a highly functional war room. Harrison bypassed the incompetent guards with terrifying ease, slipping through the mansion's blind spots and quietly making his way into the master wing. When he finally saw Dominic scarred blind, yet radiating an undeniable lethal authority, the hardened enforcer immediately dropped to one knee in absolute respect. "I am entirely at your command, boss." Harrison swore fiercely. Just point me at the absolute bastards. The retaliation began with surgical, devastating precision. Using the decades of operational secrets meticulously logged in the leather-bound ledgers from the hidden safe, Dominic began systematically dismantling Damien's fragile new empire. He didn't strike blindly. He attacked the absolute foundation of Damien's power, his money. Over the next 3 weeks, 4 of Damien's most lucrative illegal weapon shipments were violently hijacked entirely in the dead of night. The rival factions Damien had aggressively paid off were suddenly attacked by an unknown heavily armed phantom squad led strictly by Harrison. The stolen merchandise was quickly liquidated, and the massive profits were brought directly back to the hidden safe in the Hawthorne Library. Damien Cross was rapidly bleeding moneymen and crucial respect. The city's criminal underworld began whispering intensely that a violent ghost had returned to actively punish the usurper. Through it all, Madeline remained Dominic's absolute anchor. She meticulously translated the encrypted ledgers, writing out the logistical details by tracing the letters onto Dominic's broad chest or rough palms. She became the brilliant architect of his revenge, finding the microscopic flaws in Damien's heavily guarded shipping routes and silently alerting Dominic to the perfect moments to strike. Their unique tactile language evolved into an incredibly intimate, profound bond. Without a single spoken word, they understood each other entirely. Dominic relied completely on her touch, finding immense peace in the soft, deliberate strokes of her fingers against his scarred skin. She was no longer just his eyes. She was his absolute confidant, his strategic partner, and the quiet, steady heartbeat of his dangerous new life. But the violent, escalating shadow war was about to violently crash directly into their hidden sanctuary. Damien Cross was drowning in a suffocating ocean of complete paranoia. The devastating, highly precise attacks on his lucrative shipments completely convinced him that an insider was leaking crucial operational intel. He violently interrogated his own trusted lieutenants, turning his criminal syndicate into a paranoid, heavily fractured mess. Victoria was aggressively losing her patience, constantly demanding that they officially finalize the absolute legal transfer of the Castellano shipping lines before the entire empire completely collapsed around them. Desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. Damien arrogantly decided that the leak absolutely had to be coming from the only place he hadn't completely secured the Hawthorne estate. It happened on a freezing Tuesday evening. Dominic and Madeline were securely locked inside the mahogany-paneled library. The hidden steel safe was wide open, and Madeline was meticulously counting a massive stack of freshly acquired $100 bills, gently placing them directly into Dominic's hands so he could accurately feel the heavy weight of their latest highly successful victory. Suddenly, the heavy wooden library door violently shuddered. Madeline completely froze. She desperately grabbed Dominic's thick wrist, frantically tapping twice. Danger. Before they could react, the unmistakable aggressive sound of heavy combat boots echoed violently through the estate's main hallway. Damien hadn't just come for a polite visit. He had brought a heavily armed tactical squad to aggressively tear the mansion completely apart. "Search every single miserable room!" Damien's furious, echoing voice roared directly from the grand foyer. "Tear the walls entirely down if you absolutely have to find the damn communication equipment. Someone here is actively talking to the outside." Dominic's jaw clenched with absolute murderous rage. They were completely out of time. If Damien's men found the open safe, the massive piles of stolen cash, or the highly incriminating Castellano ledgers, they would strictly execute both of them right on the spot. He grabbed Madeline's shoulders in the pitch dark. "We have to get completely inside the vault," he whispered urgently, his voice barely a breath. "Now." The hidden wall safe wasn't just a small metal box. It was originally designed as a reinforced structural panic room, built deeply into the mansion's incredibly thick stone foundation by Dominic's paranoid grandfather. It was heavily concealed behind the false mahogany paneling, but it was exceptionally tight. Madeline frantically shoved the heavy stacks of cash and the thick ledgers completely back into the dark interior. Dominic expertly felt his way to the hidden hinges, aggressively pulling the remarkably heavy steel door perfectly open. They violently squeezed completely inside the freezing cramped space, just as the heavy brass doorknob of the main library aggressively began to turn. Dominic forcefully pulled the heavy steel door entirely shut, engaging the thick internal locking mechanism with a profoundly loud, terrifying click, right as Damien's armed thugs violently kicked the library doors entirely open. Inside the pitch-black, suffocatingly tight vault, Dominic and Madeline were pressed incredibly firmly against each other. There was absolutely no room to move. The cold, rigid steel pressed harshly against Madeline's back, while Dominic's massive, heavily muscled chest was crushed intimately against her front. Outside, they could clearly hear the violent, destructive chaos. Heavy bookshelves were forcefully pushed over shattering expensive glass. Priceless antiques were aggressively smashed directly onto the hardwood floor. "Check the damn walls," a gruff, heavily accented voice shouted aggressively. "The boss absolutely said there might be a hidden room." Madeline completely stopped breathing. Her heart hammered so violently against her ribs, she was absolutely terrified the armed men outside would easily hear it. She forcefully squeezed her eyes tightly shut, completely overwhelmed by the intense claustrophobic darkness and the terrifying immediate threat of absolute death. Suddenly, Dominic's large, rough hands gently found her trembling waist. He slowly moved his hands upward, perfectly tracing the delicate line of her spine, before gently resting his broad palms firmly against the sides of her terrified face. His thumbs softly brushed away a single terrified tear that had escaped her eye. He leaned his face completely down until his lips were mere millimeters from her ear. "Breathe," he mouthed silently against her soft skin, his warm breath sending a highly electric shiver directly down her freezing spine. He slowly brought his own massive chest carefully forward, completely pressing her gently against the steel wall. He deliberately matched his deep, remarkably calm breathing entirely to hers, forcing her panicked lungs to actively slow down. In the absolute terrifying darkness of the cramped vault, surrounded entirely by millions of dollars and deadly secrets, the terrifying Mafia boss became her ultimate protector. Madeline carefully raised her trembling hands, gently resting them entirely flat against his rapidly beating heart. She could clearly feel the immense suppressed power radiating from his massive frame. She slowly traced a highly delicate, perfect circle directly over his heart. "I trust you." Dominic gently rested his forehead perfectly against hers. For the very first time in his violently chaotic, incredibly brutal life, he fully realized that true absolute power didn't come from instilling terrifying fear in other men. It strictly came from the undeniable, intense devotion of the remarkable woman currently trembling in his arms. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that he would gladly burn the entire city completely to ashes before he ever let anyone harm a single hair on her head. The incredibly violent, destructive search of the library lasted for 20 agonizing, deeply terrifying minutes. The thugs heavily banged violently on the mahogany panels, entirely missing the perfectly concealed thick steel door securely hidden directly behind the dense encyclopedias. "There's absolutely nothing in here," the gruff man finally yelled in immense frustration. "The blind bastard is probably sleeping right through the entire damn thing. Let's actively check the wine cellar." The heavy footsteps aggressively retreated, and the library door slammed violently shut. They waited in absolute, incredibly tense silence for another highly excruciating hour. When Dominic was entirely certain the heavily armed squad had completely left the immediate wing, he slowly, carefully disengaged the internal locking mechanism. The heavy steel door swung silently open, allowing the faint pale moonlight to filter perfectly into the dusty library. Dominic gently stepped entirely out, immediately turning back to offer his large hand to Madeline. As she carefully stepped completely out of the tight vault, her soft hand still firmly wrapped tightly in his, Dominic didn't immediately let go. He pulled her gently but firmly against his broad chest. "Damien is entirely desperate," Dominic strictly murmured into the absolute silence of the thoroughly wrecked room, his deep voice carrying a highly lethal, deadly promise. "He knows his fragile empire is completely falling apart. Tomorrow we actively stop hiding in the damn shadows. Tomorrow the king officially takes back his absolute crown." Madeline looked completely up at his heavily scarred, fiercely determined face. She slowly reached up gently, tracing the rugged line of his jaw, and finally deliberately traced an incredibly simple, profound Y-E-S directly onto his lips. They were entirely ready for absolute war. The bleak morning sun struggled to pierce the thick, heavy fog surrounding the Hawthorne estate. Inside the concealed mahogany-paneled library, Dominic Castellano stood perfectly still, his tall, imposing figure radiating a highly lethal, terrifying calm. The devastating raid the previous night had completely failed to break them. Instead, it had aggressively accelerated the inevitable timeline for absolute war. Damien Cross was bleeding money and entirely desperate, making him incredibly vulnerable to a well-placed, highly strategic snare. Dominic gently ran his heavily scarred, calloused fingers over the smooth surface of the grand mahogany desk. Madeline stood silently beside him, her soft, warm hand resting securely on his muscular forearm. Harrison Cole, the fiercely loyal, heavily tattooed enforcer, paced methodically in front of the shattered bookshelves. His dark eyes locked intensely on his rightful boss. "Damien is completely panicking," Harrison reported gruffly, the sharp scent of stale coffee and metallic gun oil clinging heavily to his leather jacket. "His primary distributors are actively rebelling. He desperately needs to quickly liquidate the Castellano shipping lines to aggressively appease the rival factions and completely secure his highly unstable leadership." Dominic's jaw clenched with absolute unforgiving resolve. "He aggressively wants the shipping company. We will gracefully give it to him, but we absolutely dictate the exact terms of his surrender." Madeline rapidly tapped Dominic's wrist twice, her brown eyes completely wide with intense, focused questioning. She forcefully grabbed his large hand and perfectly traced a sharp, distinct HOW directly onto his broad palm. "We actively bait the trap using absolute legality," Dominic strictly replied, a remarkably dark, highly dangerous smile slowly spreading across his rugged, heavily bearded face. "Before the explosion, I exclusively retained the elite legal services of Sullivan and Cromwell, the highly prestigious, intensely private law firm based securely in Manhattan. They firmly hold the absolute unbreakable master deeds to the Castellano shipping empire. Damien arrogantly assumes he can aggressively force a completely blind, pathetic man to hastily sign away the company in a dusty, forgotten mountain estate. He is entirely wrong." Dominic turned his unseeing, intensely commanding gaze directly toward Harrison. "I urgently need you to actively round up the remaining loyalist capos, the old guard who still firmly believe in the absolute sanctity of the Castellano bloodline. Tell them the blind king is officially calling a highly formal mandatory summit." Harrison pulled out a small, heavily worn leather notebook, rapidly jotting down the strict tactical instructions. They needed a highly reliable, utterly ruthless council to successfully execute the hostile takeover. Carmine and Lorenzo have been quietly, intensely protesting Damien's highly erratic, deeply reckless leadership for several agonizing months. Harrison confirmed, firmly snapping the notebook completely shut. "If they directly see you standing strong, actively commanding the room, they will violently turn on Damien without a single moment of hesitation." Dominic slowly nodded. "Here is the exact, highly coordinated sequence of events. Step 1. Harrison will securely deliver a highly formal, intensely private legal summons directly to Damien and Victoria, officially inviting them to successfully finalize the heavily disputed shipping transfer. Step 2. The meeting will strictly take place at Pier 44, the absolute heart of the Castellano shipping empire, fully surrounded by heavily armed, deeply loyal guards, secretly loyal strictly to Carmine. Step 3. Madeline will meticulously guide me directly into the heavily secured warehouse. I must appear completely undeniably strong. No wooden cane, no pathetic stumbling. We absolutely need to aggressively send Damien a highly specific, undeniably terrifying message to completely guarantee his attendance. Dominic instructed, his deep, gravelly voice completely echoing with absolute deadly authority. A strictly formal declaration of absolute surrender. Madeline quickly grabbed a heavy, pristine sheet of expensive parchment paper and the heavy gold fountain pen that Damien had arrogantly dropped weeks ago. She rapidly placed them directly into Dominic's massive hands. Dominic firmly grasped the expensive pen and expertly dictated the strict lethal message for Harrison to loudly deliver. Now, to Damien Cross. The absolute darkness has finally completely won. The heavy burden of the Castellano Empire is far too immense for a thoroughly broken, completely blind man to heavily carry any longer. Meet me tonight at Pier 44. Bring the Sullivan and Cromwell transfer documents. You will strictly get your highly coveted shipping lines, and I will gracefully fade entirely into the quiet shadows forever. Harrison carefully took the handwritten, heavily sealed envelope, his dark eyes instantly flashing with absolute intense predatory anticipation. He won't be able to resist, boss. His massive, highly inflated ego will completely blind him to the obvious, highly lethal danger. As Harrison quickly left the completely wrecked library to violently set the massive iron trap into deadly motion, the heavy, suffocating silence rapidly returned to the Hawthorne estate. Dominic slowly turned strictly toward Madeline. He gently reached out perfectly, finding her small, fragile waist in the dark, and forcefully pulled her firmly against his heavily muscled chest. Tonight you securely stay completely behind Harrison's heavily armed men. Dominic strictly commanded, his deep voice heavily laced with immense, highly protective fear. When the violent shooting inevitably starts, you completely drop to the concrete floor and strictly do not move. Promise me, Madeline. Promise me you will actively stay entirely safe. Madeline looked completely up into his heavily scarred, fiercely handsome face. She stubbornly shook her head, even though he completely couldn't see the highly defiant gesture. She aggressively reached up, forcefully grabbing his broad, rough face with both her soft hands, and slowly, highly deliberately traced a firm, unbreakable N-O directly across his lips. Then she traced a highly distinct, deeply profound T-O-G-E-T-H-E-R directly onto his massive chest, perfectly over his rapidly beating heart. She was entirely done, strictly hiding in the absolute shadows. She had confidently held his shaking, heavily bleeding hand when he was entirely ready to violently die. She absolutely intended to proudly, fiercely stand directly by his massive side as he violently reclaimed his stolen throne. The violent, freezing rain completely lashed against the massive, rusting steel sides of Pier 44. The expansive, highly cavernous shipping warehouse was entirely illuminated by stark, aggressively bright industrial floodlights, casting long, heavily distorted shadows across the wet, highly slick concrete floor. The roaring thunder deeply, completely masked the highly intense, heavily coordinated movement of Carmine's elite, heavily armed snipers, actively taking their strict, tactical positions on the high steel catwalks above. Damien Cross aggressively strutted perfectly into the center of the massive warehouse, flanked heavily by 6 highly nervous, heavily armed thugs. Victoria Kensington walked closely beside him, completely shielded from the violent rain by a massive, expensive black umbrella. She clutched the heavy, highly prestigious Sullivan and Cromwell legal briefcase tightly against her luxurious, pristine white cashmere coat. "Dominic!" Damien aggressively shouted, his highly arrogant voice echoing violently against the thick steel walls. "Come out, you pathetic, entirely broken coward. Let's actively get this miserable, thoroughly depressing business completely over with." For a long, highly tense moment, only the violent sound of the aggressive pouring rain answered him. Then, the massive heavy metal doors at the far end of the industrial warehouse slowly, dramatically groaned open. Damien and Victoria completely froze. The highly arrogant, entirely confident smirks instantly, violently vanished from their sharply, completely pale faces. Dominic Castellano actively stepped entirely into the harsh, intensely bright industrial light. He absolutely wasn't aggressively hunched over. He completely lacked the heavy, pathetic wooden cane. He actively wore a highly tailored, incredibly expensive black Italian suit that perfectly accentuated his massive, highly imposing, deeply terrifying physical presence. His heavily scarred eyes were completely covered by sharp, expensive, dark aviator sunglasses. He strictly moved with absolute, highly lethal predatory grace, and directly by his massive side, her small, highly delicate hand resting perfectly confidently on his broad, heavily muscled forearm, was the supposedly pathetic, entirely mute Maid. Madeline wore a stunning, highly elegant black dress, her highly expressive brown eyes violently blazing with absolute, unyielding, fiercely loyal fire. She meticulously, silently guided him directly toward the precise center of the highly dangerous, completely open room. "What the hell is this?" Damien completely hissed aggressively, taking a rapid, highly nervous step backward. "Where are your heavy, pathetic bandages? Where is your miserable, thoroughly broken wheelchair?" Dominic completely stopped exactly 10 feet directly away from his utterly treacherous former friend. He highly, slowly, remarkably calmly reached up and perfectly removed his dark sunglasses, fully exposing his heavily scarred, completely unseeing eyes directly to the harsh light. "You completely took my sight, Damien," Dominic stated firmly, his deep, highly resonant baritone actively commanding absolute, terrifying obedience from every single, highly terrified person in the entire massive room. "But you arrogantly entirely forgot to actively, completely take my highly lethal, unbreakable mind." Suddenly, the heavy metal side doors of the warehouse violently crashed entirely open. Carmine Falcone, Lorenzo Rossi, and Matteo Lombardi forcefully strode perfectly into the warehouse, heavily backed by over 40 heavily armed, highly loyal Castellano foot soldiers. They aggressively, completely surrounded Damien and Victoria in a highly lethal, entirely inescapable iron circle. The formal board of capos absolutely recognizes only one true legitimate king. Carmine Falcone aggressively roared, actively racking his heavy tactical shotgun with a highly terrifying, incredibly loud mechanical clatter. "And it entirely isn't you, you miserable, completely treacherous rat." Victoria aggressively shrieked in absolute, completely unadulterated terror, violently dropping the heavy Sullivan and Cromwell legal briefcase directly onto the wet, highly slick concrete floor. She frantically, heavily, completely turned directly toward Dominic, her entirely false, heavily manipulative tears instantly, aggressively streaming rapidly down her sharply contoured face. "Dominic, please, my love." Victoria desperately sobbed, aggressively, completely throwing herself violently toward him. "Damien heavily forced me. He actively, violently threatened my life. I always deeply, completely loved you. I never absolutely wanted any of this horrible violence." Before she could actively reach him, Madeline smoothly, highly, fiercely stepped directly in front of the massive, highly imposing Mafia boss. The completely silent, highly fragile Maid aggressively, completely blocked the highly manipulative, entirely treacherous woman. Madeline forcefully raised her small hand and aggressively delivered a highly spectacular, incredibly violent, profoundly sharp slap directly across Victoria's completely stunned, heavily makeup-covered face. The shockingly loud, extremely crisp sound of the highly violent slap perfectly echoed violently through the massive, heavily silent warehouse. Victoria violently, completely crumpled perfectly to the wet floor, completely sobbing heavily in absolute, undeniable defeat. Dominic let out a low, highly dangerous, deeply dark chuckle. He gently reached perfectly out, effortlessly, finding Madeline's highly trembling, completely Victoria's hand, and carefully intertwined his massive fingers permanently with hers. "You deeply, severely miscalculated Damien," Dominic strictly murmured, actively stepping perfectly forward, completely guided safely by his utterly fearless, absolutely silent queen. "You aggressively surrounded yourself heavily with completely weak, highly treacherous liars. I actively surrounded myself completely with absolute, fiercely loyal strength." Damien aggressively, frantically reached strictly for his heavy, highly illegal firearm, but completely before he could aggressively clear the leather holster, Harrison Cole violently slammed the heavy, dense wooden stock of his tactical rifle perfectly into the immediate back of Damien's perfectly, completely terrified head. The highly treacherous, highly arrogant usurper violently, completely collapsed directly onto the highly wet concrete floor, entirely unconscious perfectly before he aggressively hit the entirely slick ground. The massive, heavily intense, heavily violent shadow war was officially, completely, entirely over. Dominic firmly squeezed Madeline's highly delicate hand, completely feeling the incredibly rapid, highly intense beating of her brave, utterly devoted pulse against his calloused, heavily scarred palm. He couldn't actively see the incredibly beautiful, highly stunning warehouse, the heavily intimidated, intensely loyal capos, or the heavily defeated, completely ruined traders violently weeping perfectly at his incredibly expensive leather boots. He completely didn't heavily, absolutely need to see any of it. He had entirely survived the absolute, highly terrifying darkness, strictly because a completely silent, entirely invisible girl had actively, bravely, entirely chosen to highly, gently, deeply, perfectly hold his severely, violently shaking hand. Dominic Castellano, the highly undisputed, highly terrifying king of the city, perfectly lifted Madeline's entirely soft hand deeply, directly to his heavily scarred lips. He completely, highly reverently kissed her bruised knuckles in perfectly front of his entire, highly dangerous criminal empire. He actively knew, with absolute, highly undeniable, perfectly profound certainty, that as entirely long as he actively had her highly gentle, utterly, completely fierce touch, completely guiding him safely through the absolute shadows, he would entirely, utterly, absolutely never walk completely blindly into the entirely, highly terrifying, completely dark abyss perfectly, ever, entirely again. And there you have it. The thrilling conclusion to Dominic and Madeline's incredible journey from a broken man left to die in the shadows to a triumphant king standing fiercely beside his silent queen. Their story proves that true loyalty and profound love can conquer the darkest of betrayals. If this intense mafia romance had you on the edge of your seat, please like this video, share it with your friends who love a great redemption story, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-pounding dramas. What was your favorite plot twist? Drop a comment below and let us know.